Pick a number, call it A, add 160,000 to it. The resulting number is greater than A. True or false? Who thinks it's true? Raise your hand. Who thinks it's false? Raise your hand. Oh, very good, very good. You're correct. The number will be greater than A. Okay, let's move on to another one. Multiplication. Pick a number, call it A. Multiply it by 160,000. The resulting number is greater than A. True or false? Who thinks it's true? Raise your hand. Who thinks it's false? Raise your hand. Well, the answer is, it depends. If A is positive, the answer will be greater than A. If A is negative, the answer is it'll be less than A. And in this equation lies the secret for how we can change the entire energy narrative around Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. Here's how. So what do these numbers represent? Well, 160,000, don't believe what the slide says, that's the number of gigawatt hours of energy that Bitcoin uses in a year. That's a huge amount of energy. A is the energy intensity of the Bitcoin network. That's the amount of, or the emission intensity, that's the amount of emissions per unit of energy. And when you multiply those two numbers together, you get the emissions of the Bitcoin network. Now you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, Bitcoin has no emissions. I know from listening to Pierre Richard that it has no emissions. Well, yes, you're correct. Like EV, it has no direct emissions. And it's a fully electrified network. And like EVs, it has indirect emissions which are caused by the underlying power source. Now, statistically, 70% of you in the room care about this, and 30% of you do not care about that. But here's why, as Bitcoiners, you should all care deeply about that. And that is that energy FUD and emission FUD around Bitcoin ends Bitcoin bull runs. Anyone remember 2021? 2 tweets from Elon Musk? Yeah. First one about emissions, second one about energy. Bitcoin price came down $17,000 from prices not too dissimilar to what they were today. And it was only once prices were at 41K that you then had the Chinese Bitcoin mining ban, but that was really like the finishing kick in the guts when it was already on the canvas. And that was also officially around emissions concerns. Now, Bitcoin may be partying like it's Q1 21 at the moment, but it's only going to take a similar celebrity or similar amount of energy FUD at the wrong time, and Bitcoin is vulnerable to a similar thing happening. So how do we stop that happening? Well, you stop that happening when A is negative. When emission intensity is negative. When emission intensity is negative, the entire equation, the entire Bitcoin network can be negative. Well, how do you do that? Well, here's how. This is a chart that I put together with Willy Woo a little while ago. It measures the emission intensity of the Bitcoin network, the amount of emissions per unit of energy. Now, grey is the hash rate here, and as you can see, that's going up parabolically. Pink is the emission intensity of the Bitcoin network, and that's falling off a cliff. In fact, in a 4-year hodl period, it is decreased by 348 grams per kilowatt hour. Now, to put that in perspective, that's 29 times faster than the banking sector is dropping its emission intensity. That's 1/4 gram of emissions per day. There isn't an industry on the planet that comes anywhere close to that. So we can do some trendline analysis and say, well, if it continues at the same trend line, because here's the thing, emission intensity is like a federal budget. It doesn't stop at zero. It can shoot right on past zero and go negative. So what would happen if we continued at the same rate of 1/4 gram per day drop in emission intensity? We can actually calculate when we'd go emission negative. And that date is the 28th of October 2026, which will kind of be a nice Halloween's Day gift for Elizabeth Warren, don't you think? So let's give her that gift, that's what I say. Not just Elizabeth Warren, but Sierra Club, Greenpeace USA, ECB, BIS, Central Bank of the Netherlands, and some of our other friends that we like to have polite discourse with on Twitter from time to time. I certainly do. So Now, like a lot of things, it's not an immutable law of nature that this will happen. It's like Moore's law. It only happens if a group of people get together and decide that it's an important and worthy goal, step one, and then step two, decide to do something about it. So how on earth do you take the entire Bitcoin network emission negative? Well, the answer to that is that you use emissions as your fuel source. That sounds weird. How do you use emissions as a fuel source? You can't burn carbon dioxide, it doesn't combust. Well, no, you can't. But there is another emission that you can use as a fuel source, and that's methane. When you combust methane that would have gone into the atmosphere, freely vented, and contributed to climate change, and you instead send that to a generator and use it to power the future of sound money, turning methane into electricity, turning that electricity into Bitcoin. That's what we're talking about. Now, the great thing here is that, now, not a lot of you may know this, but this is already happening today. Any ideas how many companies today are using methane as a power source? In other words, they're doing emission negative mining. Because they're mining Bitcoin, they are decreasing emissions. Any ideas how many companies are doing this? What do you think? 2? 10? Any advances on 10? None? 22 companies. It's an untold secret until now. So these are companies that are using either landfill gas that's venting into the air or flared, farm emissions, or methane from the oil and gas industry, and they're capturing that, sending it to a generator, using it to create Bitcoin. 7.5% of the Bitcoin network emissions is currently being mitigated by this form of mining. That's 1 in 13 parts of emissions. That's astonishing. There is not an industry in the world that comes anywhere close to this, and they're doing it without government subsidies. So how much more would it take in order to really rewrite the energy narrative around Bitcoin? Well, it's my belief from talking to some of these people who care deeply about these issues that if we were to raise this another 10% in 1 year, that would give a lot of people confidence across the political spectrum that Bitcoin not just has the theoretical potential to go emission negative, but is showing meaningful traction towards that. 10% more in 1 year would be enough to stop the existential threat that Bitcoin mining companies face on an almost daily basis. It'd be enough to give insulation against premature ends to bull runs. But something else would also be true. Now, right now, the average amount of capital allocation that one of these Bitcoin ETFs can make, if you're a fund manager there, is 2.5% of your AUM, 2.5% of your assets under management. Okay? But there's one group of fund managers and investors who cannot invest a single Satoshi into Bitcoin right now. And that is the world's ESG fund managers. Now, guess how many ESG fund managers there are? Well, I have no idea. But guess how much assets under management they have? $23 trillion. So if you punch that equation in and go, okay, these people who cannot allocate a single Satoshi to Bitcoin, $23 trillion, what would happen if they were able to put 2.5% in? Well, at today's dollar invested to market cap ratio, that would lift Bitcoin's market capitalization to over $3 million US, or around about 151,000 US dollars per coin. So there's an NGU reason to do this too. So before we look at too much detail of how we do this, firstly, how on earth did I get to be at the point where I'm about to fly to Costa Rica to immigrate with my family, not for the beaches, but for the landfills? And the answer is that it started 7 years ago when I wrote this book. Now, before I was in the Bitcoin ecosystem, I worked in the technology ecosystem. First, I ran a technology company. We were fortunate enough that we were able to sell it to a larger overseas purchaser. And then I worked as a long time, both as a coach and as an investor, to CEOs of other technology companies. And along the way, I wrote this book, which is really about my experiences of how you Communicate the value of a disruptive technology to people who either don't know about it, are scared by it, or are skeptical by it. And the book really talks about two different things. Number one is how you tell a compelling story about this disruptive technology. And the second is, what's the urgent action that you take that, when taken, will encourage people to move towards your disruptive technology, not away from it? So when it came to Bitcoin, I asked myself the same question. What's a compelling story about Bitcoin mining? Well, that's a subjective question, and depending who you ask, you would get a different answer. But here's my answer. Right now, the most compelling story in Bitcoin mining for me is what's happening in Africa. It's incredible. When you have the possibility where Bitcoin mining can render profitable microgrid development that can bring energy abundance to an entire continent that is currently in energy poverty. It is absolutely extraordinary, and if you don't know about it, I encourage you all to find out about the work Gridless and other companies are doing in Africa. Okay, so that's a compelling story. Well, that's not anything that I'm doing anything about, but I love it. What's the urgent action? Well, this is the action that isn't so sexy, but it's necessary. And that urgent action, there is absolutely no question in my mind what it is. When you are under attack by a strong opponent in martial arts, you don't win that fight by defense. You win that fight by weaponizing your opponent's strength against them. The weapon that is being used against Bitcoin is it uses too much energy. And by making A less than 0, we can weaponize that argument against the opponent by their own value systems and have them spontaneously realize that that is a good thing, not a bad thing, because the more energy it uses, the more emissions it reduces. And that will get buy-in across the political spectrum. So that's our task. Now, people like Troy Cross and Dennis Porter and myself on a regular basis are talking to regulators, ESG investment committees, and even the White House about understanding the views of Bitcoin detractors. And the good news is that whilst these people have strong opinions, these opinions are loosely held. In other words, we know from all three, ESG investment committees, the White House, and even the World Economic Forum, have all said the same thing. And that is, out of all the positive arguments about why Bitcoin is good for the energy transition, by far and away the number one is they say, if you can show Bitcoin's capacity to use vented methane to power the network and make it emission negative, that is the haymaker. That is the point we will acknowledge that it is environmentally net positive. That is the point at which we will direct our ESG investment committees to invest into it. And why are they so bullish on this form of Bitcoin mining? Well, very simple. According to the United Nations, methane is our number one lever to reduce climate change in the next 25 years. It's 84 times more warming than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And it's growing at an accelerating rate. By 2032, our largest storehouse of anthropogenic methane, that's methane produced by humans, could be landfills, overtaking agriculture. So, the problem is, though, like a lot of things, unless we can do it profitably, it's not going to happen, which is why this hasn't happened to date. But what if we could? Well, here's the challenge. Right now, on landfills, what's traditionally done is you take that landfill gas, you send it into pipes, those pipes deliver it to a generator, and that generator is used to sell that power to the grid. The problem is, in a lot of places in the world, you cannot sell that power to the grid. Either government regulation prevents it, or the grid upgrade would just cost too much. So what do you do with landfills when you cannot create power that you can sell to the grid? Well, you need to have a customer on site, wouldn't you? So I asked Nuno Barbosa, who's a 20-year expert on landfill gas power generation, how many of the world's landfills have no option to sell their power back to the grid? And he said, half of them. Half of all the landfills in the world, which will be our major methane emitter within 10 years, have no option to sell power to the grid. In other words, they have to have an on-site customer. I wonder who that could be. What a shame there's no such customer. And this is where Bitcoin mining comes to its fore. Now, our detractors would say, well, surely someone else can be that customer. Anyone but a Bitcoin mining unit. Well, no, it can't be for a very simple economic reason. And that is that Bitcoin mining companies are unique in that a very high percentage of their operational costs are electricity, typically 70 to 80%. And what that means is they will go to the edge of the earth, even to dirty, smelly landfills in the middle of nowhere to chase cheap power, and they will be prepared for the additional capital burden to get cheap power in return. Traditional data centers with an electricity bill of 30% of their OPEX, they're not going to invest the capital to do that. They might be a second customer after a Bitcoin mining company has already catalyzed the infrastructure development, but without these Bitcoin mining companies, there is no one profitably who is positioned to mitigate this off-grid, stranded landfill gas energy. One of the reasons Bitcoin mining companies love it so much is this: really cheap power. So Bitcoin mining companies want to do it. Landfill owners want to do it. So why isn't more of it happening? Well, the reason is they've lacked the marriage celebrant in the middle. They've lacked the person or the entity that's giving the infrastructure financing to make that happen. Which is why, with a couple of business partners, we decided to create the world's first Bitcoin mining fund specifically for this type of landfill gas-based power generation. And I can tell you now, I haven't told anyone this before, we have the capital to do it. So we can get started. My job for the last 18 months has been find cash and find trash. We found the cash. The harder bit has been finding the trash, or at least finding the right trash, because there is a very specific type of landfill that this works economically for. That's a landfill that's currently venting its emissions. It has to be able to generate at least 4 megawatts of power, so that's taking in 1,500 tons of rubbish per day, so it's a decent size. Probably servicing a population of at least 300,000 people, and it has to be stranded. In other words, it cannot sell power to the grid. And there has to be a landfill owner who is actually interested in earning potentially an extra $30,000 of revenue per month. So if you know people in waste management, we're actively looking for sites because we want to do as much of this as possible. By doing this, our hope is that we can start on the road to mitigating this half the world's methane that currently cannot be mitigated profitably. So let's look at what this means in terms of the numbers. So how many landfills would it take to achieve this 10% rise in the amount of methane mitigation? Taking us up from 7.5% up to 17%. A 10% rise in in emission mitigation in a year. 4 venting landfills is all it takes. Crazy low. Why? Because remember, methane is 84 times as warming as carbon dioxide. One landfill is 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year. With 4 venting landfills, that's enough to mitigate the emissions of Canberra. That's maybe a population of a size of 350,000. It's enough to mitigate 1,000 times more than the largest direct air capture project ever run, to put it in context. So we're talking about stupendous amounts of reductions. Now, let's say we go further. How much would it take to take the entire Bitcoin network emission negative? 35 venting landfills is all we take. Now that's hard, but it's not impossible. It is absolutely not impossible. And that's only 320 megawatts of energy. Now to put that in context, right now, using flared gas, there is almost that amount of methane mitigation happening using flare gas. So let's talk about the difference here. What's the difference between flared gas mitigation and vented methane mitigation, and why are we choosing vented methane mitigation instead? Very simple reason. So flared gas means that you're already burning the methane. The problem is you're not burning all of it. You're only burning 91% of it. So 9% of the methane still goes into the air. And remember, that's still 84 times more warming. So if you were to do this, choosing landfills that were currently flaring their emissions, it would cost you $4.2 billion and it would take you 40 years to do it, to take the Bitcoin network carbon negative. However, if you did it using venti methane, you can do it 10 times faster. You can do it within 4 years using 421 million. Again, that's doable. That's less than the amount of money that Crusoe Energy took in as capital in 2021. So this is achievable. Now, our vision is to not only mitigate landfills, but some of the saddest, most desolate places in the world, open dumps. Methane isn't just a climate hazard, it is also a health hazard. Methane emissions are responsible for more than 1 million premature deaths per year. That's more than the number of people in the last 12 months who died from suicide and COVID combined. People who live within a 6-mile radius of landfills typically will have upper and lower respiratory illnesses. Landfills are smelly places to work, they're also health hazards to work in. The value proposition to landfill owners, we make the landfill less smelly, less of a health hazard, we take away an environmental hazard, and we turn a waste into a source of electricity. They don't pay a single infrastructure dollar, and we take 1/20th of a football field in size as a land footprint. It's not a big land footprint at all. So, if we can make A less than 0, a lot of things suddenly change. I see a world where our worlds in ESG investment committees are scrutinized if they do not invest in Bitcoin in the future. I see a world where Bitcoin mining companies are actually able to get on with doing Bitcoin mining, not facing existential threat and 30% mining taxes on a daily basis. And I see a world where Bitcoin mining will be used at scale to solve some of the world's toughest energy transition and environmental problems. But as long as A is greater than 0, we're still vulnerable. We're still vulnerable to bull run ending FUD. But if we can make it less than 0, or even make traction along this road, then everything changes. So, I say LFG, which stands for, of course, landfill gas. What did you think it stood for? And maybe, by doing this, it could also mean NGU. So thank you.